For this episode, we recommend that you use headphones to fully immerse yourself in this global conversation, linking Silicon Valley, Boulder, Stuttgart, Amsterdam, and Singapore as we bring you the world's first 8D podcast series. Our topic is on the global implications of the coronavirus pandemic. Hello and welcome to Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. I'm Chloe Cho. Let's pick up our conversation where we left off last week. Here is Jessica Groopman, automation specialist, founding partner of Kaleido Insights in Silicon Valley.
This could very well be tied to a backlash not just against automation, but against corporatism, perhaps elitism generally. This is a current that already is clearly, as you said, well and alive in the United States and may well be conflated around sort of technology elitism, whether that is large corporations deciding and collecting your data or whether that is displacing jobs as a result of AI and automation.
David Williams, founder and CEO of Williams Capital Advisors in Palo Alto, California.
I think you see streamlined industries, but more importantly, you see much lower demand for probably years to come. Think about travel. It's hard to imagine the level of travel that people used to do happening in the next year or two, or even three. It's going to take time for people's comfort with traveling to come back, especially people over the age of 65, to the extent they're not immune to the virus. And then beyond that, people's pocketbooks have been hurt and they'll probably continue to get hurt. And so some people aren't going to be comfortable traveling just from a financial perspective. So we're talking about years worth of disruptions and kind of a smaller industries all over the globe.
Toby Ruckert, founder and CEO of UIB in Stuttgart, Germany.
This is a forced situation. Innovation will happen and we will come out perhaps on top. But it totally depends on us as humans how we deal with this situation. Politically and the society consequences, just look at India. What's going on there? There's an exodus of millions and millions of people who walk home for 2 weeks, hundreds of kilometers, entire families, because they can't pay the rent in the big cities, because they are not getting work there anymore.
And Rob van Kranenburg, founder of the IoT Council in Amsterdam, Holland.
There was a lot of talk about the super empowered individual. And there was, of course, the Assanges and the Snowdens of this world. And now all of a sudden, the biggest kind of threat is an individual. It's what they call a super empowered individual.
Pandemics have shaped civilization throughout history. As questions grow over the extent of damage from coronavirus, researchers from the San Francisco Federal Reserve have studied more than a dozen pandemics, from the most lethal Black Death in the 14th century that wiped out 40% of the European population in less than 2 years, to the more recent H1N1 flu of 2009, which took at least 100,000 lives. What they found was that pandemics strengthened the hand of the surviving workers, with real wages going up every time. Does that mean labor gains will come at the expense of capital post-coronavirus? But how will an empowered worker demand higher wages when coronavirus forces many shell-shocked businesses to integrate AI, robotics, machine learning, and automation to pandemic-proof their operations? Could the two factors emerge as a recipe for social conflict at a time of job losses?
Certainly, when you look back over the course of history, these kinds of crises prompt not just shifts in technology and innovation, but also shifts in what we think about as a safety net or even workers' rights. This is really sort of two historical tensions colliding together. On the one hand, it's true that automation, robotics, robotic process automation, AI, all of these different techniques have already been in the sidelines, certainly cropping up in manufacturing and industrial environments, to automate product development, all kinds of different processes, customer service, a huge percentage of service jobs generally. And certainly as we are thinking about public health and social distancing, by the way, major impacts on corporate balance sheets as a result of this, the drive towards robotics and AI and all of those automation technologies is only accelerated. Meanwhile, Of course, the variability in what constitutes a social safety net in any country is very wide. There is Medicare, which, by the way, came about after World War I, came about after the Spanish flu. Workers demanding rights, collective bargaining, collective action, worker protections. But what does that look like when there is very little social safety net in the United States?
There's a lot of tension, right? People have been in their homes for over a month. People are questioning how long we have to do this. Civil disobedience is a natural part of American society. In general, Coloradans tend to be really supportive of other Coloradans. And so there's a culture here, one that is not that oppositional. And so the magnitude of some of the frustrations across the state are not as amplified as they would be if there wasn't a sense, from at least my perspective, living in both urban Colorado, but also having a place in the Western Slope, the sense of local community, but also a sense of connection to the whole.
Brad Feld, managing director and co-founder of Foundry Group, joins our conversation from Boulder, Colorado. Brad is a multi-hyphenate who's worked across the U.S. as a veteran entrepreneur, investor, venture capitalist, author, and blogger, and currently serves as a tech leader in the Colorado governor's COVID-19 response team. And Brad describes the pandemic as a triple crisis unlike any the world has ever witnessed.
My view of what's happening at a high level is the intersection of three crises. And I think it's really important framing for what then happens in terms of human beings and human behavior. We have a health crisis. That health crisis has triggered an economic crisis. And I've been through plenty of economic crises, going back even to the stock market crash in 1987. This is the first time in my life I've experienced a financial crisis that wasn't a result of a financial dynamic. If you looked at the state of our country, and really the state of most of the world prior to COVID, the economies around the world were very strong. There was lots of inequity, but generally speaking, the idea that we were in for any sort of economic crisis that resembles what we're dealing with right now was something that nobody would have really contemplated. The third crisis is a mental health crisis. Human beings are not used to spending 24 hours a day in their homes. And these three things are interrelated, and none of them are easy to solve. Fundamentally, we need to be prepared for a long-term dynamic, especially in the United States, where our fundamental infrastructure is not in place to be able to manage a pandemic.
Times of transition, such as during the First and Second Industrial Revolutions, have witnessed bouts of unrest. In the early 1800s, the British Army had to deploy 14,000 soldiers, far more than the numbers needed to battle Napoleon on the Iberian Peninsula, to tame an uprising spearheaded by hosiers, croppers, and weavers called Luddites, protesting against the use of machinery. A century later, machinery debates raged in the 1920s and 30s as mass production got underway in manufacturing and consumer goods. The automation anxiety only faded with U.S. entry into the Second World War, with everyone having to work at full capacity. So if automation accelerates at a time when there are diminishing job prospects, especially for those in the low income bracket, do you think that's going to lead to social unrest?
Short term, we haven't seen any social unrest, kind of surprisingly. Longer term, I would think that that could very well happen. We're going to see unemployment going to keep growing, I think, in coming weeks, probably as big as or potentially greater than we saw in the Great Depression. So yes, that can lead to unrest. Now, the hope is that this is all very temporary, and in a few months that most of these people will be back at work. I'm not so sure that that's the case. Basically, you're going to have many businesses just simply not be able to reopen because the customer demand isn't there.
I hope it's not dystopian. I think we're in a moment where there's enormous societal adjustment going on that is happening at a pace that nobody expected or understands. in 2021, we will actually be waking up in 2025. The pace of change of things that we will experience in the next year will be as though we compressed 5 years into one. On January 1st, 2020, if you had said all of the world will be working from home and everybody will embrace work from home by April 15th, you would have been called crazy. We're now in a place where everybody has been forced to adopt technology and be facile with it so they can use it as an effective mode for work. Telemedicine made 10 years of progress in 4 weeks. When you're in a place where your hospitals are about to get overrun and you're trying to figure out how to care for patients without having them come to the hospital, especially if they don't have the deadly disease that is you're trying to treat in the hospital, but they might have a sickness, you learn pretty quickly how to do telemedicine. So these kinds of accelerated, and again, I think another 6, 9, 12 months of this will continue to have these things change. I don't have a dystopian view of how that's going to mean that we've now got half of society out of work. I think it's likely going to translate into different priorities for people and different priorities in terms of our society, and that generates lots of entrepreneurial opportunities that causes some businesses to adapt. And by the way, there's probably some very large companies that are not going to survive, and probably all this is doing is accelerating their demise.
Weighing into the debate from Singapore, AI expert and data scientist David Hardoon, whose many roles have included serving as Chief Data Officer of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the de facto central bank.
Look at what's been happening over the last few months. Things that for years we were told cannot be done are within weeks suddenly available from financial services, from consumer services and whatnot. It thrusted us into the reality whereby digitalization is a must. And in fact, any company or any organization that did not have a strategy or some extent of adoption of digitalization, I wouldn't be surprised if they're not struggling right now. Yes, there will be an impact. However, I don't believe that it will result in a situation that you'll have so many people without a job, because if anything, it now required us to have a realignment on the digital aspect of the work and the leverage of the data. And to sense, as you actually mentioned, how do we make ourselves further proofed for such changes effectively?
If new innovative ways of living can avoid a dystopian outcome from the automation transition, is the vision in line with the thinking among the intelligence and security community that foresaw a global pandemic among the 5 major threat scenarios facing the world back in 2012? Rob van Kranenburg recalls what he had grasped at the Global Futures Forum, an annual strategic foresight conference.
It was very interesting to have also lectures on anarchism. There was this whole new horizon that they had to sort of gear themselves to, and all their tools were not relevant, basically. But this is exactly what we're seeing with these governments. So there's no way that any societal model can withstand this kind of onslaught, that's how they perceive it, of the internet, the World Wide Web, and now the Internet of Things, blockchain, AI. There's no need to have a kind of representative system of 4-year democracy voting. Imagine I would have a connected car, and I would give that car one input every 4 years. So this is still how we treat the highest form of political decision making that we have in our countries. And I have more information sort of as an individual than these people. And that makes no sense.
Do you think that the world will head into that scenario, something like an anarchy?
I don't think it's going to be anarchy coming. I think the anarchy, sort of the awful situation, the burnout rates across the world, they're far higher than before this kind of a lockdown situation. So the lockdown at the moment I see as a really, really welcome pause, apart from, of course, the trouble and the people dying and all the economic troubles that people are having. But I do hope that instead of going to riot because there's a lockdown, people are going to understand and see, look, we've got to change the way we're organizing things here. We got to go to much more local production, which is really, really possible with good 3D printing and lots of IoT with lots of LoRa systems. So we should be able to sustain our basic needs and have some fun and organize some way of working with each other.
Thanks to 3D printing, robotics, AI, automation, and other technologies, Local production stands to get a boost in a post-coronavirus world with disrupted supply chains. Crises are known to breed innovation by forcing people to see things differently and take action. Do note that it was only after World War I that automobiles replaced railroads. Also, if not for military projects, microwave oven technology and the internet would have never seen their time of day.
Look, the supply chains are going to be shortened. The trade war had already started, many companies moving manufacturing back to the US or at least to North America, and this just compounds that. And so you're going to see a lot less of what we're used to in terms of free trade, and you're going to see a lot more of what you mentioned in terms of robotics and all sorts of other changes to business models that basically separate people or keep them out of range of cashiers or coworkers and so on.
The human civilization have always battled through chaos. And in a way, trouble has transported them to a higher level, to a higher being. Whenever they needed mobility, eventually came some sort of a wagon, and then that became a car. Do you think this virus situation will transport us to a much higher level?
It has the opportunity, but it depends on us. You gave the example with the horse and the wagon and the car. If you would have asked people in those days, would you want a car? They would have said no. They said, I want a faster horse. Yeah, because they don't know a car. This is the problem. I'm from Stuttgart, yeah. So one of the first cars, or maybe the first car, was actually invented here, just 5 minutes from my home. And Gottlieb Daimler, he built that motor. People thought it was a monster, it could explode or do something. They were very suspicious. So innovation doesn't happen automatically. It happens seldom proactively. It always happens when forced. Yes, this is a forced situation for innovation, for rethinking, for doing better, for coming out on top, to create a better version of ourselves and the world, definitely. However, it depends how we deal with it. It's not automatically happening. It depends on each and every one of us.
It's a shift from the existing works, it's a shift from the existing non-digital type of tasks to new roles and new jobs and a shift to new digital ones. So it's a shift effectively. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether we are willing to make that shift, whether we're willing to learn new roles, whether we're willing to take on new tasks, and whether we're willing to learn new skill sets. I think that is because even if you go back into now it's a century and a half to the Luddites, where you had the whole manufacturing line and everything. In every era, in every occurrence, there's always that message of, oh, it's going to destroy jobs, it's going to put people out of employment, but yet there is always new jobs. I mean, it's not in my generation, but we used to have buildings full of typists typing away. Now everyone's a typist, but the people who were typists, they have other jobs, they're doing other things. So we need to stop looking backwards in a sense of what's the impact going to be and what's the negative side of the delta. We need to look forwards and saying, what is the creation of the new stuff? What is the new roles? What are the new jobs that are going to replace these ones that are going to be displaced?
Post-COVID-19, how do you think the world will look if we try to imagine that scenario?
I think that we'll see a lot of fragmentations. And even when we look across Asia, Europe, and the US, all three of these massive regions are at different stages, are responding in different ways, are at varying levels of technological, health, economic viability as it is. So I think we'll see some narratives shifting and realities shifting, but it's hard to say sort of a single shared story that comes out of this. I think in many ways we stand in the US to see dramatic change with perhaps one fundamental shared question, which is how do we remain more resilient going ahead?
What will the other side of the pandemic look like? Just as every crisis comes with the flip side of an opportunity waiting to be unleashed, will COVID-19 spark a tech revolution?
I have met leaders who are rich beyond our wildest imaginations, and they are fearing the next years, not just months, not just weeks, years. They don't know whether they can manage to come out of top because they are dependent on the status quo. And then there are others. It can be an actual opportunity. I think the survival of the fittest is probably not the wrong term here. I think it's the survival of the smartest and the more courageous people as well. Because I think there may be a rise of a whole generation of innovative, creative, and courageous people in this crisis that you may have never heard of before, that may come out of hop, and everyone who listens to this, I would encourage them to think in this direction and not make this dependent on the status quo. Now, having said this, the status quo is fighting very hard for its quo status.
If we see COVID-19 as a once-in-a-century event, a turmoil that creates the next Googles and Amazons because it's going to push tech innovations even further, how will these new companies disrupt the tech landscape?
I think one of the immediate implications that we're seeing is kind of this tension between centralized governance and decentralized governance. And so those in the technology space would think of something like blockchain or distributed ledgers. But even something like this micro-fulfillment of on-demand services is an example of distributed governance. In other words, how do we implement decisions, deliver goods, manufacture goods, deliver services at the edge, if you like, or in a local community, rather than having to rely on sort of a far-off decision maker or centralized body. The fundamental technology of distributed ledgers is really around distributed governance, distributed transactions, distributed ledging of events, whether that is a good being shipped or someone voting or anything else. It is all about not relying on a centralized transaction mechanism or ledger to make those decisions. And I think this now is something that immediately comes into the spotlight because we are looking for ways to accelerate access to medical services, access to equipment, access to credentialed doctors, or whatever the case may be. This is as soon as possible kind of imperative. And so getting hamstrung or tangled up in some of the sort of big centralized bureaucracies certainly doesn't help. And in this case, actually can cost lives.
So every crisis, there's a flip side of opportunity. Do you think COVID-19 will trigger that entrepreneurial spirit and create the next Googles and Amazons? If so, what kind of companies do you think they'll be?
Well, there's no question that entrepreneurship is as or more important than it's ever been. And if you look at any other economic crisis, entrepreneurship has always been a powerful force coming out of the economic crisis. The 2007 to 2009 financial crisis, many companies were started in that time period or immediately before that time period. And the wave of entrepreneurship that was unleashed in 2010 to even through last year was extraordinary. So unquestionably in my mind, the dynamics of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial thinking, and entrepreneurial behavior is critical right now and is powerful coming out of this crisis. Interestingly, when we think about companies that are entrepreneurial companies today, they tend to fall into three categories. And this is in the middle of the COVID crisis, right? So category one is companies that actually are seeing their businesses benefit from what's going on today. One is a company, Zoom, that probably everybody is now familiar with because they're doing calls all day. Another example is Netflix, which had an extraordinary quarter that they just reported in terms of new customer acquisition, new subscriptions. You have at the other end of the spectrum companies that are under incredible distress. Travel is an example of that. Then there's a bunch of companies in the middle where it's really unclear what the actual impact of this crisis is on them. The opportunistic version of that would be a clothing distributor that all of a sudden is selling N95 masks for $8 a piece. One of the things that's useful when you think about entrepreneurship is it's not painted with a broad brush, right? This is not a situation where as a crisis, all companies are decimated. It's a situation where many companies are decimated, much stress exists. But on the other hand, there are many companies that can navigate their way through this because of how they provide goods and services to their customers.
During SARS, Alibaba had a shot in the arm because all of a sudden people in China were stuck at home and had to order online. Something similar is happening on a far greater scale with Alibaba, Amazon, e-commerce. People are simply stuck at home. What are the new Googles and Amazons that'll emerge, do you think, from this crisis, from this global pandemic, and how do you think they will disrupt?
There's a few things that come out of it. So I think one is very much in the healthcare area in terms of how do we start providing health warnings, health information, health mitigations with that extent of anonymity when we go back to normality, when we go back to normal life? Will we still have an ability to notify individuals when someone else has been ill? The other one is on this whole home-based everything, home-based work, home-based learning, home-based experiences. I think we got thrusted into it. The final one is the services one. And it has happened, it has started. So I kind of foresee that happening also for the rest of the kind of services out there. How do you find now this balance and mix and leveraging technology to do it between the offline, the premise, and the online one, whereby I'm providing these services anywhere and everywhere? The new norm is going to be different.
As the world braces for the new norm, Rob van Kranenburg says it is only natural to embrace a new wave of open source developments that'll spell a change from the past.
So if we look at the people who are revered now, like Steve Jobs, he simply ripped off Xerox PARC. Bill Gates, he closed down open source development in Word with his letter to the open source community in 1976 and became the richest man on the planet. Mark Zuckerberg, he's 19, he's building his kind of Facebook, and some friend says to him, "Oh, did some people give you data?" He says, "Yeah, dumb fucks." These are the mindsets of the people that we now see as kind of the heroes of this age, and they were all pretty petty people, I would say. They were operating on the same principles that we actually didn't want. Greed, ego, sort of like all these things. That's just the first wave. And there's another wave now in it, and it's a fully open source wave, it's a blockchain wave, it's people setting up foundations, sort of not only sort of companies. A lot of these millennials and other people, younger people, they're not in it for the Ferrari or the money. Because as things are all going very well, this is not something that should be construed into some form of actually fostering control to the extreme. Because really, if we're not able to build this backbone in a good way, it's going to be very difficult to cave our way out of Mordor.
While open source development is not always driven by altruistic motivations, it's growing rapidly in a sharing economy. That said, there is constant debate over its processes, contributions, and methodologies. A regulator should help clear the air, but that's still some years away. For now, as the world tries to re-emerge from the crisis, societies will have to deal with a more imminent, hidden crisis from the lockdowns and shutdowns.
I would not underestimate the mental health aspect of this crisis. They're probably far more consequential than the physical ones.
Mental health, certainly in the United States, has been a crisis for years now, but now really it is a shared crisis across essentially every tier or realm of society. We're all facing massive questions of every time you leave your door, you could potentially contract a deadly virus.
We are in for, as a country and as a society, an unprecedented mental health crisis.
Stay tuned for part 3 of our global conversation linking Europe, Asia, and North America as we thank Brad Feld of Foundry Group, AI expert and data scientist David Hardoon, Jessica Groopman of Kaleido Insights, Toby Ruckert of UIB, David Williams of Williams Capital Advisors, plus Rob van Kranenburg of the IoT Council. And I'm Chloe Cho. Our conversation continues next week on Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. Thank you so much for tuning in.